Greetings, everybody. Thanks for joining me for this episode of ATP Ask the Pastor. Today's question, dear Pastor, was wondering what books or other resources you would recommend to someone who wished to study Lutheranism. I was also wondering if there was a systematic theology you would recommend. All right, so you want to study and learn what Lutheranism is all about. First place you need to start is Martin Luther's Small Catechism. The Catechism is a very short summary of the doctrine of the entire Holy Scripture. Luther wrote the Small Catechism to teach and explain the six chief parts of Christian doctrine to the laity. What happened was while he was doing visitations across the churches of electoral Saxony, he discovered uh, that hardly anyone knew the basic rudiments of the Christian faith, even some priests. So the Small Catechism then was his response to that. It's still used in Lutheran churches today in what we call catechesis. That's instruction in the Christian faith that culminates then with the reception of the Lord's Supper. Now, the Small Catechism is quite small. The six chief parts of the Christian doctrine are simply the Ten Commandments, the Apostles' Creed, the Lord's Prayer, baptism, confession, and the Lord's Supper. Each of those parts then, Luther includes, or with those parts, Luther includes the texts from Scripture, followed by Luther's famous question, what does this mean? And then he explains very briefly what each commandment, petition, article, etc. means. The flow of the catechism is also helpful then for understanding uh, how the Christian life is one from law to gospel, which is born and sustained by the sacraments. That's why it begins with the Ten Commandments, goes through the Creed and the Lord's Prayer into the Christian life, into the means of grace then. So it's not just teaching doctrine, but it's teaching the flow of the Christian life, how the Christian life is lived on a daily basis, just by its form. Now, Luther also wrote the Large Catechism to supplement the Small Catechism. It follows basically the same structure. It was written for pastors and for heads of households so that they could better teach those under their care the Small Catechism. The Large Catechism is well worth your time as well because it is a fuller explanation of the six chief parts in the Small Catechism. So it's well worth your time. Some people look at the catechisms, though, and they think of them as being too simple. But Luther took a very different approach. And this is something that not only you as someone who wants to study Lutheranism, but this is something that Lutherans themselves should take to heart. He wrote in the introduction to the Large Catechism, but for myself I say this, I also am a doctor and preacher, yea, a learned and as learned as as learned and as experienced as all those who may have such presumption and security. Yet I do as a child who is being taught the catechism. And every morning and whenever I have time, I read and say word for word the Ten Commandments, the Creed, the Lord's Prayer, the Psalms, etc. And I must still read and study daily, and yet I cannot master it as I wish, but must remain a child and pupil of the catechism, and am glad so to remain. So the Small Catechism isn't something, therefore, that should be spurned or tossed aside once catechesis is complete. It's something that we should be mulling over all throughout our lives, meditating upon, inwardly digesting throughout our life, since it teaches us the Christian faith and that flow of the Christian faith. Now, one final note about the Small Catechism. You can find editions, you can find electronic editions online. Most print versions are going to contain supplementary material, question and answer sections, which are going to follow the structure of the six chief parts and further unpack them. The best and the most intuitively structured Q&A for a Small Catechism, the one that I recommend is the edition by Pastor Paul Rydecke, pastor of Emmanuel Lutheran Church in Las Cruces, New Mexico. Uh, this Q&A is the most comprehensive that I've seen. It's also up to date as far as addressing contemporary issues through the commandments and the articles of faith. You can find it on Amazon. It is well worth it. Now, once you get through the Small Catechism and perhaps the Large Catechism, the next document you're going to want to read is the is the Augsburg Confession, and then the Apology of the Augsburg Confession. So the Augsburg Confession was presented to the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire on June 25th, 1530. It was written by Philip Melanchthon. He was a fellow Wittenberg University professor with Luther and a fellow reformer. Uh, the Augsburg Confession is the confession of the Evangelical Lutheran Church. It consists of 28 articles. The first 21 address doctrine. The final 7 address abuses in the Roman Church, all of which are still happening today to various degrees. The abuse articles, though, those last 7 are well worth your time as well, not just as anti-Roman polemic, but as exhibitions of how the doctrine in the first 21 articles shapes the church's worship and practice. Now, we mentioned the apology. After you finish with the Augsburg Confession, you got to read the apology of the Augsburg Confession. Now, this isn't an apology as in, I'm sorry. It's from the Latin apologia, meaning defense. The Papist party had written a confutation to the Augsburg Confession. They read it publicly, but they wouldn't give Melanchthon a copy. And so he had to scribble down notes as it was read aloud. And based on those notes, then, he wrote the Apology of the Augsburg Confession. Now, the Apology is much longer than the Augsburg Confession because there Melanchthon is addressing specific papal arguments against the Lutheran Confession. The Apology is hands down one of my favorite works from the Reformation period because it's so much more than a academic defense of the faith. Melanchthon, as he's teaching the doctrine and as he's answering these accusations of the papists, repeatedly demonstrates how the true gospel, how the true doctrine of the law and the gospel comforts sinners, and how that gospel then comforts and moves them to new life. The Apology is one of my favorite works for the pastoral care of souls. You just can't go wrong reading the Apology. Now, after you finish the Apology, you could keep reading the other confessional documents in the Christian Book of Concord. The Book of Concord contains the Lutheran confessions of the faith, such as the Small Catechism, Large Catechism, Augsburg Confession, Apology, etc. However, if you want to delve into a systematic theology, you can find none better than Philip Melanchthon's 1535 Loci Communes, which is translated Common Theological Topics. This is the original Lutheran systematic theology. He first published it in 1521, but he expanded it throughout his life. And the reason I recommend the 1535 edition is because this edition is the one that Luther himself specifically praised. So Luther said in a table talk recorded by Caspar Heidenreich in the winter of 1542-43, he says, if anybody wishes to become a theologian, he has a great advantage, first of all, in having the Bible. This is now so clear that he can read it without any trouble. Afterward, he should read Philip's Loci Communes. This he should read diligently and well until he has finished its contents, until he has its contents fixed in its head. If he has these two, he is a theologian, and neither the devil nor a heretic can shake him. There's no book under the sun in which the whole of theology is so compactly presented as in the Loci Communes. If you read all the Fathers and the Centarias, you have nothing. No better book has been written after the Holy Scripture than Philip's. So this volume here, this Melanchthon, is remarkable for a couple different reasons. First is it's not overly long, like so many systematic theologies are today. Each chapter covers a theological topic, and that consists of several pages. It's also then helpful to read this volume immediately after you've read the Apology to the Augsburg Confession. Melanchthon wrote both of them. And so Melanchthon in the Common Theological Topics, as it's translated in English, in his Loci Communes, he's rehashing and explaining the same themes as in the Apology, using the same language so it's familiar, and he's expanding upon that. He's teaching not only the true doctrine, but again, like in the Apology, the true care of souls then, using the law, using the gospel then. He presents the biblical doctrine in such a way that he is continually moving from law to gospel to condemnation to the promise of forgiveness received only by faith. Melanchthon lays out the Lutheran doctrine in a clear and concise way that makes his work very accessible, not only for pastors and parishioners, but for anybody who's interested in Lutheran doctrine. The 1535 edition is published just now recently by Repristination Press, and you can find it on Amazon. One final systematic theology which I want to recommend, along with Melanchthon, is Johann Gerhard's Succinct and Select Theological Aphorisms, also published by Repristination Press, available on Amazon. Each chapter contains brief aphorisms that clearly state the doctrine of Scripture. Like Melanchthon's Loci, this is a work that you're going to use over and over and over again. So there you go. Lutheran confessional documents start with the Small Catechism, Augsburg Confession, Apology, Melanchthon, Gerhard. With them, you can't go wrong. I'm glad you've got interest in the doctrine of the Evangelical Lutheran Church. God be with you in your studies. We'll see you next time.